Good morning, Wabash. Professor Dan Rogers is chair of the Department of Modern Languages here at Wabash. After receiving his PhD from the University of Kansas, he came to Wabash in 1998. In addition to teaching Spanish, he founded and directs the Wabash program in Ecuador, and when not preparing chapel talks or looking through his telescope, Professor Rogers publishes articles on women writers in Mexico and South America. With his chapel talk entitled, Dr. Coss Wants You to Get Out of Town, The Case for Study Abroad, please welcome Professor Dan Rogers.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much. I was just telling a few of you that I'm least nervous about giving the chapel talk. What I'm most nervous about, and so I've got my copy up here to help remind me, are the words to Old Wabash for when I finish and have to stand up here and make sure that I don't fumble my way through the fight song too badly. Now, when I was standing out toward the rear, I realized that the lights are shining on Dr. Coss for some of you. So make sure that you get a glimpse of him before you leave today. And before I start, I want to thank a few people. First and foremost, I want to thank Beth Swift. I don't know if Beth is here, but Beth really helped. She's director of the archives, and as I was going back and looking at Dr. Coss's life and legacy, she was invaluable. And as a matter of fact, this portrait of Dr. Coss normally hangs in the archives. And I'd also like to thank a student of mine, Mark Perikin, right here, who helped me run down a lot of the nitty-gritty, the details of his correspondence and letters, all that kind of research work that he was very helpful. Thanks, Mark. It would have been difficult, I think, to tell in his early years that John Jacob Coss would grow into a world traveler with a national reputation as a great educator. We don't talk about him very much anymore. Probably few, if any of you, have ever heard of him. You know, you look around at the portraits on the walls of the chapel or in the archives, and they're kind of anonymous faces, unfortunately. But the cool thing is that there are great and interesting stories behind every one of them. And the portrait of Dr. Coss is no example. So today I want to summon Dr. Coss, Lazarus-like, from the grave, and ask him what he might tell us about his alma mater today. John Coss graduated from Wabash College 103 years ago, back in 1906. He was a townie, and so of course, he was a beta. Don't let anyone tell you that Wabash traditions are short-lived. Coss was another in a long line of men who fit the archetypal Wabash story. A provincial Midwestern kid graduates from Wabash, moves to New York, gets famous, becomes a trustee, receives an honorary degree from Columbia University, has a spectacular academic career, and then gives back to the college heart, soul, and riches. End of story, right? Wrong. We are all born provincial to some degree. To be provincial is to lack culture and sophistication. That's why we're here at Wabash. One of the primary goals of college education is to remedy this apparently natural shortcoming in human nature. At least Coss thought so. Coss did much to shape the campus as we know it, and he wanted Wabash, perhaps above all other things, to provide an enriched and sophisticated education for our students. An education that built on the best of our homegrown Midwestern values, at the same time that it produced sophisticated, open-minded students capable of traveling, working, and interacting with a variety of people from other places and other cultures. As chair of the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures, Coss is particularly dear to my heart because he recommended, not surprisingly, that Wabash hire its first full-time language professors in French and my discipline, Spanish. A born administrator in every positive sense of the word, he was, during the First World War, he was commissioned a lieutenant colonel and, attached to the quartermaster general's office, literally helped the Army get organized. I don't have time to tell about that part of his life, but his work in Washington during that First World War really is fascinating. Now, in the 1920s, New York was quite arguably the intellectual center of our nation. And after the war, he returned there, and he became a professor of philosophy and later dean of the prestigious Columbia University. In both these roles, Coss learned how great students and great faculty were formed. He knew that to prosper, to shake off their provincial trappings, they needed to grow at Wabash and beyond. By 1922, he was on his way to becoming one of the most powerful and influential Wabash trustees of his time. In his role as trustee, on May 28, 1923, he wrote a now famous letter to President McIntosh reporting on the status of the college and providing a blueprint for its future. Today, we'd call it a strategic plan, and it would have taken years to prepare and even longer to implement. In 1923, it was brief, pithy, a call to action, and it got nearly immediate results. It also wasn't very democratic, to be fair. He told President McIntosh which buildings to construct, commented forcefully on what he took to be shortcomings in student conduct. He could do so. He was a Wabash grad, after all. And he urged him to fire some professors, and he named names whose teaching, in Coss's own words, had, quote, become a joke. He knew what he wanted for Wabash, and he knew how to achieve it. Coss also knew that the key to Wabash's success was the ability and opportunity for faculty, students, and administrators to preserve long-held values on the one hand and look to the world outside for ideas on the other. The design of the chapel in which we are now gathered demonstrates Coss's glorious and decidedly unprovincial stereo vision. That is, his ability to look both directions at once. Coss comments to President McIntosh on the particulars of the chapel's construction, and it demonstrates abundantly his sense that Wabash must look both inside itself, but also to the world outside to find its future. He writes, quote, "The chapel I would build of old-fashioned brick, with a white wooden steeple on the lines of a New England 18th century church, the kind our founders knew," end quote. What could be more traditional? What icon could more clearly evoke the core values we hold dear forevermore as in days of yore? Which, by the way, comes from the second verse of the fight song, which I really don't have memorized at all. But then, just as importantly, Coss adds, quote, "An outstanding architect should be retained," end quote. And he wasn't talking about a local architect. He wanted a building for the ages, and he knew it would take expertise from beyond the sacred and at times provincial boundaries of our college to build it. Coss knew that we have to reach into our past and look to the outside. He knew that our identity as a college is deeply rooted from the inside in the vision of its founders, and he knew our identity needs to be nourished with new ideas from beyond. We know he valued ideas and experience outside the walls of our college because Coss, like few trustees before or since, believed in travel. When he died, a considerable part of his estate went to establish a fund to enable people to get out of town. If you're a stickler for detail, and I'm looking for my good friend David Phillips, See if he's in the audience. It was actually his sister Millicent who made the actual bequest. Millicent Coss, who had inherited John's estate and, one assumes, a good portion of the family fortune, wrote in her will that the funds she wanted to memorialize her peripatetic brother should, and I quote, be applied for the use of the college by way of enabling members of its faculty to travel, end quote. In other words, it paid for faculty to get out of town. And John Coss certainly thought that some Wabash faculty could benefit from a view of the world from beyond Montgomery County. In his letter to McIntosh, he makes the particular case that Professor George Karskalen in math needed some time abroad. Some of you may have heard the name George Karskalen. We have a reading room, and the Karskalen Math Prize is named after him. Karskalen was apparently an interesting fellow. According to one story, told by a retired member of the math department and relayed to me by his son, Jim Swift, Karskalen was so cheap that he turned his car off at the top of a hill near his home and coasted in to save gas. Some days, he misjudged his timing, perhaps underestimating the coefficient of drag, and ended up short of his target. On those days when he couldn't quite make it, Mrs. Karskalen had to come out of the house and push the car into the garage. Now, I don't know if Coss knew about his driving habits, but we know that he thought Karskalen lacked culture. In early 20th century parlance, culture meant, quote, this is from the OED, refinement of mind, taste, and manners, artistic and intellectual development. Although making your wife push your car on a regular basis might be considered bad manners, not to mention a short trip to marriage counseling, I think Coss had the last part of the definition of culture in mind, intellectual development. In his letter to McIntosh, he wrote, quote, I do not think that Karskalen is an asset in his contributions to the culture of the college. Perhaps he will grow. A summer in Europe will help him a great deal, end quote. If anyone knew George Karskalen, it was John J. Coss. They'd been Rhines together and in the same graduating class in 1906. I think we can be assured that Coss knew of what he spoke, and he thought Karskalen needed to grow. He knew that travel outside Indiana, outside the U.S., was the best way to further Karskalen's intellectual development. And it must have worked. Karskalen has become a legend in the math department. Now, to be fair, he didn't just pick on Karskalen. Coss's letter to McIntosh is peppered with the word grow. Always, he wanted faculty, and by extension their students, to grow. Now, I know what a summer in Europe, or Ecuador for that matter, can do for a student. It helps students grow in extraordinary ways. It was a bit of a hard sell at first, initially at least, when Greg Redding and I started the Ecuador program 7 years ago. We didn't design it to produce modern languages majors. Perfecting students' language skills was not something we necessarily had in mind when Greg and I kicked around the idea of an Ecuador program. We imagined taking students with limited Spanish skills and no real experience studying abroad, and then opening a new world to them. In essence, we imagined tapping into that core Wabash value that Coss championed, helping people find themselves through study abroad. Isn't that an example of what Wabash has always done best? I would guess that most Ivy League-bound young men have already had the experience of waking up in another country, hearing other languages, and navigating in unfamiliar cultures. I wonder what percentage of Yale's entering class have never traveled abroad, or perhaps never even boarded an airplane. It can't be very many. As I travel in Europe, Mexico, and South America, I sometimes come across members, young members of the privileged prep school crowd who are working so hard not to be too impressed with what they're seeing. I'm amazed at how young they are to be as cynical and world-weary as they appear to be. The Ecuador program that I direct with the help of Jane Hardy often takes students who never traveled outside the Midwest. We occasionally take students who have never boarded an airplane. And I can tell you, Wabash men aren't world-weary sophisticates feigning boredom. Wabash students are wide-eyed and hungry for the opportunity. I had this fact confirmed in a curious way this past summer when I found myself, thanks in part to what the Coss Fund has now become, in fact, for faculty development. I found myself in Aguas Calientes, Peru, a small town near the famed Incan ruins called Machu Picchu. With several other professors from a variety of colleges and universities, I participated in a summer short course on Incan mathematics and astronomy, sponsored by the University of Texas. It's been invaluable in helping me prepare for a freshman tutorial that I'm teaching right now. This freshman tutorial was in fact born from an earlier course, a course I team taught with Rick Warner and Jim Brown. And curiously, the archaeologist leading this course in Peru that I participated in, Ed Barnhart, is a friend of Rick's. That shouldn't surprise you at all. Rick Warner has friends everywhere in Latin America. Ed is a well-known expert in New World pre-Columbian archaeology, and he was an invaluable resource when we taught our course on Mayan archaeoastronomy last year. He and his colleagues have met Wabash students and guided them through the compelling ruins of Palenque, Bonampak, Yaxchilan, and others in southern Mexico. Now, as I got to know Ed better on this short course in Peru and asked his help in imagining an archaeoastronomy freshman tutorial, we had ample opportunity to talk about you, to talk about Wabash students. Ed tells me that Wabash students stand out in his mind from other students that he meets because they are, and these are his own words, Ed says they are wide-eyed when they see Mexico for the first time. According to Ed, our guys are fairly unique for the ease with which they express unfeigned amazement and wonder. When you travel with our guys, Ed says, you really get the sense you're showing them something completely new, taking them far outside the boundaries of the world they usually inhabit. During the Ecuador program, I see that same wide-eyed astonishment at a couple of key moments. When students arrive in Ecuador with me, we place them in host families from the very start. The Continental Airlines flight that we take typically gets to Quito after 10 p.m. in the evening, well after dark on the equator. As students deplane, they have to steady themselves as they walk, and I'm looking at a few of you who have been to Ecuador with me. Mr. Johnson, sitting here in the third row, knows well that you've got to steady yourself as you walk up the jetway in some very, very thin air. A sign greets our students, greets everybody with these words in both Spanish and English. Welcome to Quito, Ecuador. Elevation 9,200 feet above sea level. Please walk slowly. Tired from a day spent on planes and in airports and fighting the altitude, our guys gamely make their way through passport control and customs and walk out into the waiting crowd of people. I wish I could show you the scene as I see it. A pair of sliding glass doors open, and one by one, Wabash students trickle out of the customs area, toting their baggage and trying to take in the chaotic and completely unfamiliar scene around them. The terminal is crowded with Ecuadorian families waiting for loved ones to arrive, And the noise and commotion is just this side of overwhelming. Our students step into this maelstrom activity, and before they know it, I've introduced them to the host family that will guide their introduction to South American culture and speak only in Spanish for the next 2 weeks. As we say in Spanish, en less than un santiamén, our guys are whisked away from the airport, speeding through the impossible labyrinth of Quito's old city streets, tired, oxygen-deprived, and completely out of their element. You can't imagine the meaning of wide-eyed until you've seen a Wabash student during his first few minutes in Ecuador. These are the moments I look forward to, and I think Coss would have agreed. The longer I've been here, the more convinced I am that we are at our best as a faculty when we give our students these kinds of exceptional opportunities. I see it happen on the basketball court, in ball theater, and in Ecuador. Students going beyond what they ever thought themselves capable of doing. Students given the opportunity to, in Coss's simple word, grow. Our college mission statement doesn't insist that we turn our students into many versions of ourselves. It doesn't specify that we make students into academics necessarily. Certainly, some of them go on to be great scholars and academics, just like John Coss and his friend George Carscallon. But I think more and more that this is incidental to our mission. Our mission is to help students grow. And I'm with Coss. A summer in Europe helps a great deal. Thank you very much.